Captain Hanbin of the Galactic Confederation vessel Starweaver had never encountered a species quite like humans. Standing on the observation deck, his crystalline eyes reflected the blue and green planet below. The diplomatic mission had seemed simple at first: make contact, establish relations, and report back. But after just 3 days of watching Earth, Hanbin's carefully ordered world was turning upside down. His crew had been chosen for their stability and logical thinking. The Confederation valued order above all else. Their ships ran with perfect efficiency, their society operated on precise schedules, and their decisions were always based on careful analysis. This had served them well as they explored the galaxy, meeting other species who shared their appreciation for logic and structure. Until Earth. "Sir," Lieutenant Jai-Yun's voice carried across the deck, breaking his contemplation. "You need to see this immediately." Her normally composed features showed clear signs of distress. Her secondary breathing gills were fluttering rapidly. Hanbin glided across the polished floor, his movements precise and controlled as expected of a Confederation officer. When he reached Jai-Yun's monitoring station, she gestured at her display screen with a trembling hand. "They're doing it again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The screen showed a group of humans climbing into a flying vehicle. This itself wasn't unusual. Many species had mastered flight. But what happened next made Hanbin's facial tentacles curl in shock. The humans were deliberately jumping out of the perfectly functional vehicle. "Are they being forced?" he asked, searching the image for signs of weapons or threats. "No, sir," Jai-Yun replied. "This is what they call skydiving. They do it for fun." Hanbin watched as the falling humans deployed thin fabric devices that slowed their descent. Their vital signs, monitored by the ship's sensors, showed elevated heart rates and increased adrenaline levels. Yet remarkably, their facial expressions showed what the translation matrix identified as excitement and joy. "This can't be right," Hanbin muttered. "Check their criminal records. This must be some form of punishment." Jai-Yun shook her head. "I already did, sir. These are ordinary citizens. In fact, they paid money to do this." Hanbin's secondary brain began processing this information while his primary brain continued watching the display. The humans landed safely, gathered their equipment, and began planning their next jump. "Pull up the data from other observation posts," he ordered. The main screen filled with images from around the planet. Humans were climbing frozen mountains without any practical purpose. They were strapping boards to their feet and sliding down snow-covered slopes. They were jumping off platforms attached to elastic cords. They were diving into ocean depths with minimal protection. "Sir," called out another officer, Dae-sung, from his research station. "I've been analyzing their entertainment broadcasts. They simulate dangerous situations for pleasure. They deliberately seek out activities that trigger fear responses. They even create artificial challenges just to overcome them." Hanbin's facial tentacles were now fully curled, a sign of deep distress in his species. "Are they damaged? Perhaps their risk assessment capabilities are faulty." "No, sir," Jai-Yun responded. "Their scientific achievements suggest high intelligence. They've split atoms, explored their solar system, and developed complex technologies. They understand the risks. They just don't seem to care." The observation deck fell silent as the crew tried to process this information. Their entire society was built on minimizing risk and maximizing efficiency. The idea of deliberately seeking out danger for pleasure was completely alien to them. "There's more, sir," Dae-sung added hesitantly. "They do something called pranks, where they deliberately trick each other for amusement, and they gather in large groups to watch others pretend to be people they're not. They call it theater." Hanbin moved back to the main viewport, staring down at the planet. The Confederation had encountered many species over the centuries. Some were aggressive, others peaceful. Some were technologically advanced, others primitive. But all of them had followed some form of logical behavior pattern. "Send a message to command," he finally said. "Tell them we need to revise our contact protocols. Standard diplomatic procedures may not be sufficient for this species." As he watched another group of humans prepare to jump from a perfectly good aircraft, Han Bin realized that this mission would be unlike any other in Confederation history. These humans weren't simply behaving illogically. They were embracing it. They weren't crazy in the traditional sense. They were something else entirely, something the Confederation had never encountered before. They were insane by choice, and somehow they were thriving because of it. The real question now was, how does one negotiate with a species that finds joy in defying logic itself? Dr. Taiho watched through the observation window with growing confusion. His neural scanner kept telling him there must be an error in the readings, but he had checked the equipment 3 times already. Everything was working perfectly. It was the results that made no sense. In the simulation chamber, Lena hung from an artificial rock face, her fingers gripping tiny holds as she searched for her next move. The young human female had volunteered for these tests, just like dozens of other humans. But unlike the logical species the Confederation usually dealt with, she seemed to be genuinely enjoying herself. "Your heart rate has increased by 40%, Taiho noted, speaking into the chamber's communication system. "Your body is producing stress hormones. All indicators suggest you are in a state of fear." Lena laughed, another behavior that baffled the research team. Why did humans make that sound when experiencing positive emotions? She reached for another handhold, her muscles straining with the effort. "Of course I'm scared," she called back. "That's what makes it exciting. The fear is part of the fun." Dr. Minja, Taiho's research partner, made a small sound of distress. Their species didn't have a word for fun. The closest translation was satisfactory completion of a necessary task. The concept of deliberately seeking out fear for enjoyment had caused 3 of their best xenopsychologists to request transfers. "Perhaps we should end the test," Min Jae suggested. "Her vital signs indicate distress." "No, wait," Taiho replied, his scientific curiosity overriding his concern. "Subject Lena, can you explain why you choose to do this activity?" Lena had reached a small ledge where she could rest. Sweat glistened on her skin. Another response their species had evolved past centuries ago. "It's hard to explain," she said, taking a drink from her water bottle. "It's about challenging yourself, pushing your limits. Sometimes being scared helps you discover what you're capable of." The researchers exchanged glances. Their society was built on knowing exactly what everyone was capable of and never exceeding those boundaries. The idea of deliberately pushing past limits was considered dangerous at best, insane at worst. "But you could die," Min Jae pointed out. Lena shrugged, another uniquely human gesture. "That's why we train and use safety equipment. The goal isn't to die, it's to live more fully by facing our fears." Taiho adjusted his neural scanner again, focusing on the pleasure centers of Lena's brain. To his amazement, they were highly active despite, or perhaps because of, the fear response. Subject shows simultaneous activation of fear and pleasure responses, he noted in his research log. This contradicts all known patterns of healthy brain function in sentient species. The chamber door opened as another researcher entered. Dr. Yuri was carrying a data pad with results from other human test subjects. "You need to see this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We've been analyzing their entertainment content. They deliberately seek out simulated fear experiences. They watch stories about danger and death. They play games that mimic survival situations. They even have designated buildings where they pay to be frightened." Lena, overhearing this, called down from her perch. "Oh yeah, haunted houses are great. You should try one sometime." The 3 researchers stared at her in horror. The idea of paying to enter a building specifically designed to trigger fear responses seemed like a form of self-harm to them. "But why?" Taiho asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. What possible evolutionary advantage could this behavior provide? Lena thought for a moment as she began climbing again. Maybe it's because we learn more about ourselves when we're scared. Maybe it's because facing small fears helps us handle bigger ones. Or maybe, she grinned, reaching for a particularly challenging hold, it's just because humans like to prove we can do things everyone says we shouldn't be able to do. As the researchers watched her continue her climb, Tai-Ho made a final note in his log. Human subjects appear to have evolved beyond using fear as a pure survival mechanism. They have somehow transformed it into a tool for personal growth and, inexplicably, entertainment. Standard psychological models may need complete revision for this species. When Lena finally finished her climb, she was breathing hard but smiling broadly. That was awesome. What other tests do you have? Something exciting, I hope. Tai-Ho looked at his colleagues, then back at their eager test subject. They had planned a series of calm, logical exercises to assess human cognitive function. Now he wondered if they needed to completely rethink their approach to understanding this strange species. After all, how do you apply logical testing methods to a species that seems to thrive on defying logic itself? The emergency council chamber was filled with the gentle hum of holographic displays and the nervous movements of various alien species. Admiral Min-Ki's projection stood in the center, his usually composed features showing signs of distress that made his facial tentacles twitch uncontrollably. 3 colony worlds have fallen, Min-Ki reported, his hologram flickering as distant explosions rocked his command ship. The Dark Swarm moves like a perfect machine. They anticipate and counter every standard response we make. Around the circular chamber, representatives from 50 different species shifted uncomfortably. The Confederation had always prided itself on its logical, ordered approach to warfare. Every tactic was carefully planned. Every response calculated for maximum efficiency. Jun Seo, the first human representative to the Confederation, sat quietly in his chair, watching the other species react. As the youngest member of the Confederation, Earth's seat was positioned near the back of the chamber, but Jun Seo didn't mind. It gave him a better view of everyone else. The Dark Swarm operates as a single mind, Min-Ki continued, his image stabilizing. They learned from each engagement. Our standard attack patterns are now useless against them. They counter our formations before we can even complete them. The chamber erupted in suggestions, each species offering their traditional military solutions. The Valerians proposed more complex formation patterns. The Xyle suggested increasing the size of their fleet. The Quinn recommended a full retreat to consolidate forces. Jun Seo listened to them all, noting how each suggestion followed the same logical, predictable patterns that had already failed. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke up. Perhaps that's your problem right there. You're being too predictable. The chamber fell silent. Dozens of alien eyes, tentacles, and sensory organs turned toward him. Being unpredictable was considered a sign of mental instability among Confederation species. To suggest it as a strategy was almost taboo. Explain, demanded High Counselor Ray Jin, his crystalline form shimmering with concern. Jun Seo stood up, straightening his diplomatic uniform. The Dark Swarm beats us because they can predict what we'll do. So let's do things they can't predict. Let's be random. Chaotic. Let's break all the rules of engagement. Horror rippled through the chamber. Admiral Min-Ki's hologram flickered again as he processed this suggestion. Break the rules. But our military doctrine has been refined over thousands of years. Exactly, Jun Seo said, warming to his topic. And that's why it's failing now. The Dark Swarm has studied our doctrine. They know every move we'll make. But humans, he smiled, humans are really good at being unpredictable. This is madness, whispered one of the Valerian representatives. Maybe that's exactly what we need, Jun Seo replied. He walked to the central display and pulled up footage of human history. Look at our military history. Our greatest victories often came when we did the unexpected. We attacked across frozen rivers in winter. We used music to break enemy morale. We painted warships in zigzag patterns to confuse targeting systems. The chamber watched in fascinated horror as Junseo showed example after example of human military insanity that had somehow worked. The Dark Swarm operates on pure logic, he continued. They can't understand or predict illogical actions, so let's give them something they can't process. Let's have ships perform random maneuvers. Let's blast Earth music on all frequencies. Let's challenge them to dance battles in space. Dance battles. Admiral Minke's hologram actually stuttered. Why not? They won't expect it. And while they're trying to figure out what we're doing, we hit them where they least expect it. The chamber erupted again, this time in protests about the insanity of such suggestions. But High Counselor Roijin raised a crystalline hand for silence. 3 colony worlds have fallen, he said slowly. Our logical approaches have failed. Perhaps it is time to try something illogical. Junseo watched as the notion spread through the chamber. He could see the internal struggle on each alien face as they contemplated embracing chaos as a strategy. If we do this, Admiral Minke said carefully, we'll need human commanders. Our own officers. We're not capable of such unpredictable behavior. Earth's fleet is at your disposal, Junseo replied with a grin. And trust me, we have plenty of commanders who excel at being unpredictable. As the chamber began organizing this unprecedented approach to warfare, Junseo sat back down, satisfied. Sometimes the best way to fight perfect logic was with perfect insanity. And humans, he thought proudly, were masters of controlled chaos. The Dark Swarm was about to learn that there was something far more dangerous than a predictable enemy, an enemy who didn't play by the rules at all. Admiral Minke's facial tentacles had frozen in a position the human doctors might have called a stroke. He stared at the battle plans projected in the command center, his crystalline eyes refusing to process what they were seeing. You want us to do what? He asked again, hoping he had somehow misunderstood the translation. Junseo stood calmly before the massive holographic display, pointing out various elements of the plan. We'll make them think we're completely incompetent. First, we'll have our ships perform random maneuvers. The more nonsensical, the better. Then we'll broadcast Earth music on all frequencies. Finally, we'll challenge them to dance battles. Behind him, Commander Suji was already at work, her fingers flying over multiple control panels as she organized Earth's fastest ships. She had specifically chosen pilots known for their ability to improvise and their unusual approach to spatial physics. Most of them had been labeled as problematic by traditional military standards, which made them perfect for this mission. This isn't warfare, Minke protested, his secondary breathing gills fluttering in distress. This is madness, Suji offered with a grin. Exactly. That's the point. The command center buzzed with activity as human crew members began implementing their strange new strategy. They were selecting music, everything from classical symphonies to the latest pop hits. Some were programming what they called dance moves into the ship's maneuvering systems. Look, Junseo explained patiently. The Dark Swarm operates on perfect logic. They analyze patterns and respond with mathematical precision. But you can't analyze what makes no sense. You can't predict random. Minke watched in horror as human pilots began practicing their new maneuvers in the simulator. Ships spun in impossible patterns, executed barrel rolls for no tactical reason, and moved in ways that violated every principle of space combat doctrine. We've chosen pilots who scored lowest in pattern recognition tests, Suji added proudly, but highest in creative problem solving. They don't think in straight lines. They think in squiggles. Squiggles, Minke repeated weakly. The translator matrix struggled with the word. One of the human pilots, a young woman named Hei-Yun, stepped forward to demonstrate her planned approach. In the simulator, her ship performed what she called a cosmic breakdance, a series of spinning maneuvers that made Minke's inner equilibrium system protest just watching it. See, the Dark Swarm will try to predict where we're going, Hei-Yun explained enthusiastically. But we won't even know where we're going until we get there. And the music? Min-Ki asked, dreading the answer. Psychological warfare. Jum-Seo beamed. We'll start with something classical. Maybe Mozart. Then switch to heavy metal. Then some K-pop. Keep them guessing. Plus, some of our best pilots fly better with a good beat. Commander Suji pulled up another display showing the pilot selections. We've got a former street dancer flying our lead ship, 3 pilots who used to perform in zero-gravity circus acts, one who claims she learned spatial navigation by playing dancing video games, and a guy who swears he flies better hanging upside down in his cockpit. Min-Ki's facial tentacles were now completely rigid, a sign of severe mental distress in his species. The Confederation has spent millennia perfecting the art of space warfare, he said quietly. And that's exactly why we're losing, Jum-Seo replied. The Dark Swarm has studied every perfect formation, every logical tactic, but they've never seen anyone fly like humans do when we stop trying to be perfect. Around them, the command center had transformed. Human crew members were teaching alien officers how to feel the rhythm of ship movements. Pilots were sharing their most illogical flying stories, each trying to outdo the other in terms of absurdity. We're calling it Operation Chaos Dance, Suji announced proudly. First wave launches in 6 hours. We've got ships practicing moves called the spinning top, the cosmic shuffle, and my personal favorite, the space noodle. Min-Ki looked at the battle plans one more time. According to every military simulation, every tactical analysis, and every logical consideration, this plan was pure insanity. It violated every principle of warfare he had ever learned. Which was, he was beginning to understand exactly why it might work. Very well, he said finally. Proceed with Operation Chaos Dance. But please, he added as an afterthought, don't tell the High Council I approved this. They would never understand. Jum-Seo and Suji exchanged grins. The Dark Swarm was about to learn that the most dangerous enemy wasn't one who followed the rules of warfare. It was one who threw out the rulebook entirely and decided to improvise. As Min-Ki watched the final preparations, he wondered if perhaps humans weren't insane after all. Maybe they had simply figured out that in a universe of perfect logic, the most powerful weapon was the ability to be perfectly illogical. Young Ho's eyes were fixed on the massive battle screens that filled the command center's walls. What he witnessed defied every principle of space combat he had studied in his 3 centuries as the Confederation's chief strategist. The scene before him wasn't just chaos. It was orchestrated insanity. Earth ships darted between the Dark Swarm's perfect formations like leaves in a storm. Their movements followed no recognizable pattern, instead resembling what humans called freestyle dance. One ship would spin seemingly out of control, only to use that same spin to launch a perfect attack. Another would fly backwards while firing sideways, its pilot reportedly singing along to something called hip-hop. This cannot be possible, Yum-Ho muttered, his secondary brain struggling to process the data while his primary brain remained frozen in shock. Captain Myre stood beside him, her eyes gleaming with pride as she watched her pilots perform. "Watch Hae-Yun's squad," she said, pointing to a group of ships performing what looked like a synchronized swimming routine in space. They practiced this move at their last dance competition. Dance competition. Young-Ho's translator matrix struggled with the concept. The Dark Swarm's perfect hexagonal formations were breaking down. Their ships, programmed to predict and counter logical attack patterns, couldn't adapt to enemies that moved like drunken butterflies. Every time they analyzed a human ship's movement pattern, the ship would suddenly change its entire style. "Look there," Myre exclaimed excitedly. A human pilot had just executed a maneuver that the Confederation's simulators had labeled as mathematically impossible. The ship had somehow barrel-rolled through its own weapon's energy field, using the feedback to boost its speed. "Our simulators clearly state that such movements would tear a ship apart," Young-Ho protested weakly. Myre laughed, a sound that still made many Confederation officers uncomfortable. "They're not actually impossible," she explained. "We just have to believe they aren't." Sometimes that's enough. The battle continued to unfold like a chaotic dance performance. Earth ships were broadcasting a mix of music that jumped from classical orchestras to something they called dubstep. Some Darksworn ships actually seemed to pause mid-attack, their systems apparently struggling to process the sensory overload. There, Mirai pointed to another screen. Suji's team is starting their space noodle maneuver. Young-ho watched in horrified fascination as 5 ships began moving in a pattern that seemed to defy the laws of physics. They weaved around each other in impossible curves, their energy trails creating patterns that made his visual processors ache. The Darksworm's programming is based on predicting logical responses, Mirai explained, watching as more enemy formations fell into disarray. But how do you predict a pilot who decides mid-battle to try a move because it feels groovy? The command center's atmosphere had changed dramatically since the battle began. Human crew members were dancing at their stations, claiming it helped them get in the zone. Some had convinced their alien colleagues to try moving to the music's rhythm. Young-ho had even caught one of his most serious analysts tapping their appendage to the beat. Our tactical computer has crashed 3 times trying to analyze these maneuvers, Young-ho admitted. It keeps insisting the movements are errors in the sensor data. Mirai grinned. That's exactly what's happening to the Darksworm. They can't process what they can't predict. And humans, we're really good at being unpredictable. A cheer went up from the human crew members as another Darksworm formation collapsed. The enemy ships, trying to adapt to the chaos, had begun moving in increasingly erratic patterns themselves, but without the humans' intuitive understanding of controlled chaos, they only succeeded in breaking their own formations. But how do your pilots know what to do? Young-ho asked, his scientific curiosity finally overcoming his shock. They don't. Mirai replied simply. That's the beauty of it. They're improvising, feeling the flow of battle like it's a dance. Each pilot adds their own style, their own flair. The Darksworm can't predict what we're going to do because even we don't know until we do it. Young-ho watched as the battle continued to unfold. His logical mind wanted to dismiss this as pure luck, but the results were undeniable. The Darksworm's perfect military machine was being defeated by what appeared to be a space-based dance party. Perhaps, he thought, watching a human pilot perform a maneuver that looked suspiciously like a breakdancing move, there was a method to their madness after all. In a universe governed by logical patterns, the ability to break those patterns became a superpower of its own. The humans hadn't just embraced chaos, they had turned it into an art form. The prestigious halls of the Confederation Academy had never seen anything quite like this. For centuries, these corridors had echoed with the measured footsteps of perfectly disciplined cadets. Now laughter rang through the ancient building, and students could be seen doing something entirely new. They were having fun. At the center of this controversial transformation stood instructor Jin-A, her human presence causing ripples through the Academy's carefully ordered structure. She had spent 3 years on Earth as part of the cultural exchange program, and had returned with ideas that made the traditional instructor's facial tentacles curl in horror. Today, Jin-A announced to her packed classroom, "We're learning about winging it." She smiled at the mixture of confusion and excitement on her students' faces. Some of the alien cadets had already started adopting human mannerisms, like smiling and showing enthusiasm, behaviors that had been strictly discouraged before. The Academy's senior instructors watched from the back of the room, their crystalline forms rigid with concern. The concept of intentionally entering situations without a perfect plan was more than revolutionary. It was practically blasphemous to their carefully ordered society. In traditional Confederation training, Jin-A continued, "You learn to create perfect plans for every situation. But what happens when you face something completely new? Something your plans didn't account for?" A young Valerian cadet raised his sensory appendage. "We retreat and analyze the situation until we can form a perfect plan," he recited. "And how did that work against the Darksworm?" Jin-A asked gently. The classroom fell silent. Everyone knew about the recent victory over the Darksworm, and how it had been achieved through what the Confederation termed human chaos tactics. Sometimes, Jin A explained, the best solution isn't the most logical one. Sometimes you need to trust your instincts, take risks, and yes, wing it. To demonstrate, she set up a simulation. The cadets faced a series of unexpected challenges, but this time they weren't allowed to stop and analyze. They had to react, improvise, and trust their gut feelings. Another human concept that confused many species who kept their digestive organs in different locations. The results were messy. They were chaotic. They were imperfect, but they were also surprisingly effective. "Look at this," one of the senior instructors exclaimed, checking the performance metrics. Cadet Sunmai just solved a tactical problem in 3.2 seconds that would normally require 47 minutes of analysis. But she didn't follow proper procedures, another instructor protested. No, Jin A agreed. She trusted her instincts and found a new way. That's what winging it is all about. The controversy spread beyond the classroom. In the academy's dining hall, cadets had started experimenting with mixing different food items, a practice that horrified the nutritional optimization staff. In the recreation areas, they were playing games with no clear winning conditions, simply for the joy of playing. The Academy's administration called emergency meetings to discuss this troubling development, but they couldn't argue with the results. Graduates of Jin A's program showed a 300% increase in problem-solving capability. They adapted faster to unexpected situations. They found solutions that the tactical computers hadn't even considered. But it's not proper, the Academy's director complained during one such meeting. They're becoming unpredictable. Exactly, Jin A replied, just like the universe itself. The change wasn't limited to the Academy. Across Confederation space, the victory over the Dark Swarm had sparked interest in human methods. Ships were being redesigned with what engineers called flow-state capabilities, allowing for more intuitive control. Some species had even started organizing dance classes, though most still struggled with the concept of moving without a specific practical purpose. In her classroom, Jin A watched with pride as her students grew more comfortable with uncertainty. A Xyle cadet had discovered she could improve her tactical performance by humming, something that would have been unthinkable months ago. A Quinn student had developed a new problem-solving technique that combined traditional logical analysis with what he called creative vibes. Remember, Jin A told her class, the goal isn't to abandon logic. It's to understand that logic alone isn't always enough. Sometimes you need to embrace a little chaos to find the best solution. The Academy was changing, one spontaneous decision at a time. The carefully ordered halls now echoed with occasional bursts of laughter. Students could be found having impromptu brainstorming sessions in corners, their ideas flowing freely without the constraint of formal meeting protocols. And perhaps most surprisingly, some of the older instructors had begun to change too. One had been caught tapping their appendage to music. Another had actually made a joke during a lecture, though they immediately filed a formal apology for the unplanned verbal deviation. The universe, Jin A reflected, was vast and unpredictable. Perhaps it was time for the Confederation to become a little more unpredictable too. The final battle against the Dark Swarm unfolded like nothing the galaxy had ever seen before. Commander Suja stood on the bridge of her flagship, her voice carrying across all frequencies as she coordinated the most unusual military operation in Confederation history. Battle formation moonwalk. Execute now, she commanded, and the combined fleet of human and Confederation ships began to move in patterns based on Earth dance movements. The massive starships flowed through space like dancers in perfect sync, their movements completely unpredictable yet somehow harmonious. The Dark Swarm's hive mind struggled to process what it was seeing. Their perfect mathematical formations began to break apart as they failed to predict where the Allied ships would move next. Every time they thought they had discovered a pattern, the pattern would change. Now for the final, Suji announced with a grin. Operation Freestyle. The fleet split into smaller groups, each executing their own unique dance-inspired maneuvers. Human pilots led their Confederation partners in movements that defied traditional space combat doctrine. Ships spun and twisted around each other in impossible patterns, while their weapons created what looked like a cosmic light show. Aboard the Dark Swarm command ship, their tactical computers crashed repeatedly, unable to process the chaos unfolding before them. Their perfectly ordered mind couldn't comprehend an enemy that turned warfare into an art form. The battle ended not with a dramatic final explosion, but with the Dark Swarm's complete withdrawal. Their hive mind had encountered something it couldn't analyze, couldn't predict, and therefore couldn't fight. They retreated to the outer rim, leaving behind only a simple message: "You are not what we expected." In the aftermath, Captain Handbin stood on the observation deck of the Starweaver, just as he had when this strange journey began. Earth rotated below, its blue oceans and white clouds as beautiful as ever. But now he saw it differently. What had once seemed like a planet of illogical creatures now appeared to be a world of infinite possibilities. His report to Confederation High Command was surprisingly brief. Humans are not crazy. They are not insane. They are something far more dangerous. They are innovative. The report sparked intense debate throughout Confederation space. Some species began cautiously experimenting with human concepts like spontaneity and creative thinking. Others remained firmly committed to their logical ways, though even they couldn't deny the effectiveness of human methods. The Confederation Academy established a new department dedicated to studying human problem-solving techniques. Young cadets could now take classes in intuitive decision-making and creative combat strategy. Some even started organizing dance classes, though most species still struggled with the concept of moving without a practical purpose. In the human diplomatic office on Earth, Jun Seo read Captain Hanbin's report and laughed. His own desk was a perfect example of what the Confederation found so baffling about humans: organized chaos. Reports were stacked in what looked like random piles but made perfect sense to him. A half-finished cup of coffee sat next to a traditional Confederation crystal, its perfect symmetry contrasting with the casual disorder around it. The victory over the Dark Swarm had taught both humans and the Confederation valuable lessons. The aliens learned that perfect order wasn't always the answer, while humans gained a greater appreciation for the power of their own unconventional nature. As Jun Seo prepared for another day of bridging the gap between human and alien cultures, he reflected on how far they'd come. The Confederation had initially seen humans as primitive and unstable. Now they studied human methods, trying to understand how apparent chaos could lead to such effective results. Perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, not the defeat of the Dark Swarm, but the beginning of true understanding between such different species. The Confederation was learning that sometimes the best way to be logical was to embrace a little insanity, while humans were discovering that their seeming madness was actually a unique form of wisdom. The next time Captain Hanbin visited Earth, he actually tried skydiving. He didn't enjoy it, but he understood it a little better. Sometimes, he realized, you had to jump without knowing exactly where you'd land. That was the human way. And now, increasingly, it was becoming the way of the galaxy itself. In the end, it turned out that humans weren't crazy or insane. They were simply the first species to discover that in an unpredictable universe, the ability to be unpredictable was the greatest advantage of all.